How do these features work with level streaming and larger or open world designs? Nothing really changes there. Fortnite is based on level streaming. We have one landscape actor, but it's split up into landscape proxies. And each one of those is just kind of deriving from the main landscape, and it's split up. And that will further be managed by the grid-based streaming that was mentioned toward the end of the presentation. Andrea Goet, can I pursue a career in 3D environment art with a background in landscape architecture? Absolutely. Just start experimenting and creating designs, playing with materials, learning 3D applications, anything you can do to get your feet wet. I would say give it a chance. Go for it. Mariano Morgan Fogert, apologize if I can't get these names right. In what branch of the engine can I find 426? 426 is not actually released yet. It's something that we are estimating to be sometime in the fall, but that's still being locked down. And the next question, Gregory Caron asks, when is 426 estimated to be out, which we just answered, sometime in the fall. Bernardo Aquino asks, world height is actually a map, and that's in reference to the runtime virtual texture. And that's correct. We have a separate asset that you would create, and that is set to be the world height map. And then that basically acts as a texture sample that you place in any of your materials. Arnav Rai asks, what is the layers different from each other? I'm not completely sure there, but the different layers that you add in the edit layer stack, they're basically additive layers. So if you have one layer at the base that has nothing on it, and then you had another layer above that and you painted some height there, that second layer would just store the differences between what's underneath it and itself. So yeah, if you sometimes can get weird effects if you go to a layer that's higher up and paint a bunch of stuff, and then if you hide the layer that was down below, you will see just the delta of that layer. And that might be a little weird, but it's also great for the type of transient edits that we showed in the talk, say, where you want to have a temporary crater that's easy to erase after the fact. It's perfect for those situations. Scott Wilkerson asks, is the world height how you are flooding and unflooding the map? Actually, no, we don't use the runtime virtual texture for the water. We just have access to that global water texture map, the same map that has the velocity for the flow maps. That tells us the terrain height as well as the water height. So we can compute a dynamic water depth by just computing a max of the stored water height versus the flood water height, which is set by a blueprint. Will RVT, or Luciano Giacomelli asks, RVT will support displacement in physical materials? Currently, displacement is supported the standard way, and physical materials just go through the same regular path they've always gone through, where it will choose the largest of the landscape layers and just pick that. So Philip McGuire asks, please could you expand a little bit on how runtime virtual texture improves shader complexity? So you could think of it as if you have a really complex layer, say you have 10 layers of different dirts and grasses and things. If that's covering the whole screen, with a regular material, every frame you're going to have to draw all 10 of those layers, and each one could have 3 or 4 different textures. And if you think about that, if you're not moving the camera around a lot of that work is really similar between frames. So you're just redrawing the same dirt floor over and over again. Runtime virtual texturing takes advantage of the fact that you might not be moving through the world super quickly. So what if you just rendered that really complex material once and kind of cached it off, and then you only had to re-render it once you moved really fast outside of the bounds of where it was rendered. So RVT, the performance benefits do depend on things like world scale and player speed and things like that. So Mosh Verma asks, can we use the system for other more realistic games? Absolutely. Nothing here is specific to Fortnite. In fact, we kind of have to try harder to make things feel stylized by limiting the complexity and trying to just be very simple with the expression. And you can find some details about that when I talked about the waves during the presentation. Release the Unreal project of Fortnite. That's not something we have any plans to do at the moment. Carlos Fernandez, how many sublevels does the Fortnite map have? And how are these organized in split, lighting, sublevel geometry, etc.? So the main geometry for the landscape is split into a grid. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure exactly how many levels, but it was in the presentation. I think it's either 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 levels. And then there's a few different levels for things like gameplay events, the challenges. We place those in a few separate levels that are just always loaded because there's not too much point in spatially streaming them, especially if it's things like challenge actors that you're going to run into all across the map. There's not a whole lot of point in streaming that. Um, Luke Avanash asks, do layers help keep certain terrains hidden until the update? We don't tend to have a whole bunch of extra layers in the terrain. It's more we have one base layer, one spline layer, and then one layer for details and painting. And usually that's where transient edits or tweaks to the layer system where the splines or water brushes are done. And sometimes they will do a transient edit in that top layer and then later be able to erase it more easily. Yu Gu asks, can I merge group of landscape layers? So unfortunately, that is not a feature that's been implemented yet. One way that you can get around that is if you export the height map from landscape layers, it's always going to export the merged single height map. And then when you re-import it, you're kind of stuck with a single layer at that point. But that's one way that you can export. And you can manage to export partial layers by basically hiding the other layers that you don't want to export or setting them to 0 for now. Mikkel Alabau asks, is it possible to do tunnels with the spline layer? Out of the box, it's not really designed for that, but you could probably make it work using some custom meshes and disabling some of the terrain conforming tools. But you'd still have to do things like make a landscape hole material to be able to poke a hole in the landscape like you've always done. Okay, let's see here. And then another one from Carlos Fernandez. How long is the Fortnite map in width and length? You know, off the top of my head, I can't recall exactly, so I probably shouldn't just make up a number, although I wish I had looked that up beforehand. Ian Helfrich asks, will the terrain editing be added to the in-game creative editor? And how do you determine what to add to the in-game editor? That one I'm not sure about at the moment. It's definitely been asked a few times, but a lot of the tools that we're using for the new terrain tools use the GPU in a way that is not easily conducive to applying onto things like consoles and different platforms, but I wouldn't rule it out completely. I just don't think it's something we're going to do with the very first rendition. Okay. Ankit, I'm not even sure if I'll try to pronounce this last name. How do we create open world landscapes? Do we have to import any asset or is there a tool? The best way to get started is probably to do the tiled landscape import, which is part of the world composition tool. You have to use world composition in your world settings, and then you would open up the level browser and there should be an option to do a tiled import. And that can come from someplace like World Machine or pretty much any other terrain DCC. Nathan Schewitz asks, these tools look amazing. Are there any tutorials available? For the water stuff that was shown today, this is pretty much all that's been shown so far, just because these tools are still in development. But we should probably expect to see at least a basic tutorial or documentation come along with 426. Luke Avanash asks, was it tricky and challenging to create the water bodies? If so, how long did it take to make the final outcome? Yeah, we had kind of a small strike team of a few engineers on the open world team, rendering teams, and a few people from the tech art team all working on it. And it did take, a couple months of prototyping and R&D, and as well as working with the level designers to figure out what did they want to do and what did they want to express with the tools. But we didn't have too much longer than the standard Fortnite update cadence, but we did start planning a little bit in advance by a few months for that. Matthew Carter asks, can the hater system, I assume layer system, be applied to a spherical world like a planet? At the moment, no, it's pretty much still using the standard system of a two-dimensional height map. You'd have to do a little bit of customization to make that work. Jose Salvert Torres asks, what is the class to inherit from to create water system spline objects? So there's the water spline class by itself is just water spline, but it won't really do anything by itself other than provide data for the water system. The class that will be in existence for the water plugin is just called water body at the moment, and you could derive from that, although it's unclear yet how open and extensible the system will be. So stay tuned for updates there as we get closer to releasing something. Amir Shabani asks, how can we access the landscape collision and modify it in runtime or real time? That's not really something that I would say has much to do with the water system or recent updates. It's more of a gameplay coding question, and I probably would defer that since I don't have a great answer for that. Stephen Ulabari, does the river spline tool force you to stay close to sea level or take into account the upstream points must always be higher than downstream points? No, it just lets you place the river points anywhere that you want, and it will then make that global texture of the rivers and oceans and everything. So you can actually make some fantastical, unrealistic things like rivers flowing uphill if you wanted to. And river velocity is basically just a scalar that's either positive or negative. And whether it's positive or negative really has just to do with the direction that you made the spline in originally. It doesn't really mean uphill or downhill. It just means forward tangent X or backward tangent X. And you just tweak those to look decent. All right. Nation Schuetz asks, the water splines, what is required to set up a water material to be compatible with this? So for the most part, it works with any material that is set to use the single layer water system. But there's also a few other things right now that are just being done as material functions that we hope to make a little bit more built in as part of the system. For example, I mentioned that there's that material or that texture created with the flow map velocity and the landscape and water height. There's a material function that references that in the water material, and that's what paints the flow maps and also conforms the river height. So for the rivers, we're not actually using spline geometry. We're using the same geometry that we use for the oceans and the lakes, but we use the vertex shader to displace the vertices to the height of the actual water. So pretty much at the moment, you just have that material function in your shader, and that causes it to work. But that should hopefully be streamlined a little bit more as we get closer to release. Hamzi Makamuki, instead of manually modeling these terrains, would there be instances where the maps would be generated bottom up? I'm not entirely sure what the question is getting at there, but you could definitely use procedural methods, from World Machine or custom brushes in the engine, or just random noise seeds to create your terrain to start with as well. Hopefully that answers it a little bit. Chris Murphy asks, can the water system apply with a level of simulation for realistic river flow, for example? So there is some internal experimentation being done there. We've done some experiments making the landmass plugin work with water simulation based off of the terrain. There's also some additional work being done on Niagara to do some shallow water simulation working with terrain. All that stuff, we should have more information as we get closer to 426. Pius Schoenberg asks, how can you detect if a character is inside a water spline or river and do foot splashes and sound, for example? So we make kind of a collision mesh based off of the geometry of the water spline, and that's what's used to determine gameplay interactions. Aleski Melkor asks, maybe I missed that. Are these tools available in the editor in general, or are they developed for the Fortnite project only? So far they are part of the Fortnite project only, but we've just started the internal initiative to merge everything out to the main engine and kind of rebuild it from scratch up with a little bit of a cleaner base. So hopefully we have something nice and simple, but also with all the features that are important. Jack Smith asks, can wave parameters be changed in real time to simulate different weather conditions? At the moment, we don't have any apparatus for that, but technically there's nothing preventing you from doing it. The only thing that I would caution there is the only real parameters you would want to change in real time would be probably the amplitude, because when you start changing things like the wavelength, you have to be incredibly subtle with the changes, because you actually end up creating some kind of artifacts where you're not really changing just the current state of the waves. You actually change the state of those waves from the origin of time, and time is usually some big number. So it gets a little bit confusing to change stuff like that, but the amplitude is always safe to change on the fly without any ill effects. Medi Steiner again asks, can the ocean system for Fortnite work with the ship game? Yeah, it can. The only thing I'll say is that our physics for vehicles are probably fairly simplistic, and you would want to add more buoyancy components for a larger ship if you wanted to have, like a big cruise ship or an oil tanker or something like that. But we do plan to ship some basic buoyancy and gameplay physics that you could use as a starting point. Liam Heron asks, do you mainly use editor utility widgets for Fortnite? And if so, what do you use them for? Thanks for the video. We actually have just started using editor utility widgets a little bit more, kind of as part of the backend pipeline process system for doing things like making sure a whole bunch of static meshes have the right LED options checked, or to audit content. There's all kinds of things that you can use them for. We use them to make a right-click option to, check if all of the LEDs have, make sure there's not an LED 3 with more verts than an LED 2, for example. We've done all sorts of things that look at assets and spit out data. there's really no right or wrong way to use those. It's pretty much open to interpretation. Remy Vaj asks, does the new ocean system make it possible to create convincing breaking waves along the shoreline? When will this feature be released? So that the breaking aspect of the waves, I would consider a little bit of a separate polish feature outside of the main just physics of the wave itself. It's something we hope to get into an example project, but no guarantees on that, just because there are a lot more challenges, such as getting the effects to look good. But it's on the list, probably as a stretch goal. Richard Berry asks, are the waves and flow maps purely visual, or do they affect the player? So the waves and flow maps both affect gameplay and rendering, and that's done through. So for the waves, what we actually do is we store the wave parameters in a little render target that just has the wave values written out as single texels in a row, and then we can reference that pretty much everywhere, and we write all the water bodies to one texture. So which water body is basically just the Y row in that texture. So it's pretty easy to retrieve all the wave parameters just by saying what water body index do you have. And then the flow map, so for the gameplay side of it, objects basically ask the spline what the velocity was. So we mentioned before, you have the collision of the mesh. That tells you, do you need to check the spline? And then gameplay code will find the spline point closest to you and then get the velocity there. And then it's just going to linear interpolate between points, which is more than enough. So yeah, characters and gameplay objects will feel the effect of the flow and flow downhill. Okay. So let's see, we have a few more minutes here. So Luke Avanashkin asks, is there a way to give clouds more complex and random shapes? So yeah, it's completely up to what you do in the material graph. I would suggest go back and rewatch the part of the talk that went over building up from the little sphere and adding the volume noise and shaping it. You can add more detail with more textures. You can use a straight up 3D volume texture to exactly define the shape. It's just you start to lose resolution, but not generally a concern once you start adding in your tiling noise to break it up. Brian Cozens asks, what kind of performance impact can we expect from the volumetric cloud system? It really depends on what quality settings you set it to. So if you want to render it without downsampling it to a render target, which means it's at full screen, it's going to be pretty expensive, and you pretty much have to dedicate a substantial part of your budget. But if you're going to ship it on console like PlayStation 5, what you probably will have is rendering it to a render target, which is the default, which means it does it at a downsampled, I believe, half resolution. And then shadows are also traced at half resolution as well. But you should still expect at least a few milliseconds. I don't have any detailed stats right now, but and of course, you can also use the system to render out a pre-baked cube map, which is something people should look into if they want to get all the benefits of dynamic creation, but want to get quick rendering. Spencer Melnick asks, what kind of optimizations are used for the volumetric cloud system? Pretty much it's rendering at half res or quarter res. You can change it with some CVARs to adjust how many steps are taken for the density, how many steps are taken for the shadows, how many kilometers the ray march goes, as well as a couple other little CVARs like that, which can affect the quality. So there's plenty of options to tweak performance. Nicholas Hellish asks, for the grid system, would it in theory support grids in the Z-axis as well? I only ask because the example shown used X and Y. That one I am not 100% sure of. I believe it's the case, but I don't want to give an answer that is misinformed there. But yeah, I don't see any technical reason why it wouldn't be able to use the Konstantin Yakshchenko, apologies again for name pronunciation. When will be one file per actor? In what version? Last I had heard that was meant to be 426 as well. Jordan B asks, you showed a stylized cloud slide. How did you create the volume texture for that? So that was actually using all the same volume textures as the other clouds. The only difference there was that there was some curl noise added, and that's added through the vector noise material node, setting it to curl noise type, and then using that to advect the UVs of the other noise nodes. And then to create the appearance that the noise was kind of reacting to the shape of the clouds, the base noise pattern was used to disturb the coordinates of the base curl noise. So that causes those little wavy lines to generally conform to the round shape of the cloud and make it kind of look like brushstrokes are coming off of the edge. But it's a fairly expensive technique compared to the simple shaders that were shown with the graph, just fair warning. Chris Kerrigan asks, does the blueprint foliage paint tool work with procedural foliage too? So because it's a new type of foliage actor, you can hook it up anywhere where the foliage type was hooked up previously. So there should be no problems there. Adam Stiles asks, how do you make the foliage blend in with the terrain? Is shown 5 minutes ago. I'm not sure where the foliage blended in with the terrain, but we did do some virtual texture blending, and that was basically done by referencing the runtime virtual texture in a material, and then blending with the world height, which was the other runtime virtual texture. Yeah, and then blending, using that to blend to the rock where the foliage is original material, and then to the runtime virtual texture near the ground. Then we have Cesar Cortez asks, will this water system run on mobile Switch specs? Yes, we actually use all the same water system on the mobile platforms for Fortnite. The main difference is we switched to a much cheaper rendering type. So on PC and consoles, the water system actually has some nice features like colored transmittance, and it's actually rendered as kind of opaque in the rendering path. For mobile, we actually render it with the standard translucency path, and we lose out on that colored transmittance based on depth. So we kind of have to pick a single bluish tint to give the water instead of that nice, blue-green, dark blue gradient that you get from Bora Bora that we see normally. But that's really the only difference. And of course, we don't do the fluid simulation and other expensive things. Luke Avanash asks, other than Fortnite, will there be any other games that will utilize this layer system? Absolutely. Can't comment on any other games we may or may not make, obviously, but for our tech demos and little one-off projects, we use whatever tools we can at the time. So we don't really make a conscious choice to only use this for Fortnite. It's more that we add it to Fortnite because we know that'll give us a really good push to get it into the engine. And, now we can focus on making it work for everybody. Carlos Fernandez asks, how many features of what you've shown in this talk are custom to Fortnite only, and how many features will be available to the engine for us to play with? To the best of my memory, pretty much everything in this presentation is meant to go out to 426, or sorry, to Unreal Engine. The features that said 426 would be. Most things we showed here, we tried not to show things that were going to be withheld. The idea was to show, here are some tools that we use to make Fortnite that in the future everyone else will have access to as well. Let's see. So it looks like that takes us up through the end of our questions. And this is actually the last track at Unreal Fest today. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who came and watched this talk. And I hope you guys got a lot out of it and enjoyed all the other sessions and everything. And stay tuned for all the updates that we talked about. And hope you guys enjoy 426 and using all these tools. All right, everyone. Thanks so much.